Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Just going to give people a minute or two to trickle in, and then we'll kick things off.
Okay.
Well, good morning from Toronto, Canada, and welcome to the Creating a World for All Ages, Looking Back and Moving Forward webinar. My name is Anna Sangster, Program Manager with the International Federation on Aging, and it is my distinct pleasure to be your moderator today and be joined by our featured presenter, Ms. Alana Officer, Unit Head Demographic Change and Healthy Aging from the Department of Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization. Ms. Officer has led the development of the World Report on Aging and Health, the Global Strategy and Action Plan on Aging and Health, and has led the coordination of the development of the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, as well as overseeing WHO's work on ageism, including the Global Report on Ageism, as well as the development of age-friendly environments. It is an honor to welcome her participation in this third and final webinar, which will touch on some exciting new topics, including new evidence on AI and ageism, as well as the effect of COVID-19. Before we begin, I want to briefly take the opportunity to review some general housekeeping. The webinar today has been equipped with French simultaneous interpretation. To enable this function, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select your preferred language. During the live Q&A portion of the session, please feel free to use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question, and you will be called upon to come forward. In an effort to make this session more interactive, please also use the chat feature to ask any questions that may be posed during the course of the presentation, and these questions can then be picked up during the Q&A portion. This webinar will be recorded, and the video recordings and resources, including slide deck, will be made available post-webinar to all registrants. Please ensure that your microphone is muted at all times during the session unless you are called upon to speak during the live Q&A. Lastly, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the support of the Government of Canada in the delivery of this important webinar, and to thank you all for your time in attending. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to you, Alana. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Anna. I'm really excited to be with you today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So I'm going to kick off by just looking again at what we understand in terms of ageism. So ageism is really refers to how we think, how we feel, and how we act towards others or ourselves based on age. So it's really the stereotypes, the prejudice, and the discrimination on the basis of age. And if we think about the recent pandemic and look at how ageism played out in terms of COVID, just understanding, we saw that at many times there was a very dangerous narrative that took root during the pandemic. The sense that all older people were frail and vulnerable and even dispensable. That because in effect that they would have died anyway, that the health and the economic costs of protecting them were somehow not justified. And you'll see on this slide a horrendous example of ageism within the pandemic in terms of that sense of boomer removal. There was also an incredible amount of prejudice against people of all ages as well, but that sense that we needed to protect older people, that as I said, that older people, oh, we're going, sorry, I'm going to go back. And that also just the fact that it wasn't only older people, that also young people were being vilified as being reckless and irresponsible for spreading the virus because they're supposedly invincible. So ageism, as you know, is on this sort of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination on the basis of age, and it can affect people of all ages. And what happened was during the pandemic, in terms of, examples, we saw that older people mobility was restricted. For example, there were lockdown measures that only applied to people of a certain age group. Yeah. We found that across many countries, data, in fact, either wasn't being disaggregated, certainly in the beginning around age, or as you would have noted in terms of nursing homes, we weren't even collecting data around the world on older people, yeah, which is really another example of ageism. The sort of general disregard in the early phases of the pandemic for older people in care homes, even though we were beginning to become aware of the fact that age was a factor, and certainly underlying health conditions or increased frailty was also a factor in terms of mortality and poor health outcomes, there was really a delayed response in terms of nursing homes, lack of PPR, poor linkages in terms of our healthcare systems. Now, these are all examples of ageism in terms of how discrimination plays out. Another example that we saw within COVID in terms of ageism was where chronological age was used as the sole criterion for when you give resources. Yeah, so like age cutoffs in terms of triage or access to oxygen. These are examples of ageism. So age, and this was a challenge within the pandemic, age can be an important factor in assessing what we might want to do, but certainly ageism has no place in terms of resource rationing. So when we think about resource allocation, in addition to age, we need to be able to think about, is somebody particularly frail? Do they have any other conditions which might impact their ability to benefit from the treatment or to recover? So what is their otherwise functional status? So there's many other things that need to be considered in addition to age in the way that treatment was and is still provided within the pandemic. So these are just examples of how ageism played out in terms of COVID. Now, just a reminder for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to join us on a webinar around the Global Report on Ageism, we produced a report last year, and that report found that in fact 1 in 2 people around the world are ageist against older people. 50% of the population have negative attitudes towards older people, with rates much higher in low-income countries. So it really, prior to the pandemic, ageism was incredibly prevalent. We don't have as much data around the world on how ageism plays out in terms of younger people. We have some pretty good data from Europe. And that indicates that, in fact, younger people report more age discrimination than older people and other age groups. Yeah. So ageism is certainly something that cuts across all ages. And it's important to ask ourselves a question. So we know that ageism is prevalent, the data says it is. And the question there is it harmful? Does it actually do any damage in terms of individuals in our societies? And the report outlined that, in fact, it's incredibly harmful. So it has really far-reaching impacts on our health, our physical and mental health, and our social well-being. So we have slower recovery from disability, increased mortality. So we die on average 7.5 years earlier if we've got very negative attitudes towards getting older. Increased rates of depression. So really significant impacts in terms of our physical and mental health. But also it tends to, another thing which I find really interesting as well, is that we're more likely to take risks. So if we're sort of negative about getting older, we're more likely to eat an unhealthy diet, drink excessively, or smoke. It's interesting that it plays out in terms of our desire to adopt healthy behaviours. But more than that, and I think this is really important, is it sort of devalues our ability, I'm trying to get to the next slide, to benefit from what younger and older people can contribute in our societies. Ageism also tends to erode solidarity between our generations and can have really serious economic consequences for us as individuals in terms of our health and well-being, but also for societies. So in conclusion, ageism is incredibly harmful. But a really exciting point, and it is that ageism, in fact, can be combated. There is evidence around different strategies that work in reducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And there's three things that we were able to find that worked. Yeah, the first one is policy and law, educational activities, and intergenerational activities. And policy and law is most effective, in fact, at addressing discrimination and inequality on the basis of age and protecting the human rights of everyone, everywhere, at all ages, if they're covered in terms of international or national policy and law. Educational activities are really effective because what they do is they can help enhance empathy. They can challenge the sort of misconceptions that we have around age and aging, i.e. all older people, will, experience disability or will decline, yeah? Or all older people are frail, so all older people are a burden to, our healthcare system. So, to be able to challenge these misconceptions, which are in fact not true. Education's really helpful. In terms of intergenerational interventions, they're great because they bring together different generations. And by doing that, they can challenge the sort of intergroup prejudice and the stereotypes that exist perhaps between younger people and older people. So these three interventions are the only ones that we could find strong evidence for in terms of effectiveness. And where possible, implementing the three of them together has a much stronger potential of reducing and preventing and responding to ageism. And I wanted just to make a little point on the issue of evidence, yeah? So we've known about ageism for over 50 years, yeah? And we've seen it, if you look at the evidence, we've seen it get worse over time. And countries and civil society and academics have been investing in a lot of activities to try and prevent and reduce ageism. But despite this, ageism has been flourishing, yeah? And that's why I want to stress, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today, around the importance of investing in evidence, so in things that work. Unfortunately, most interventions do not work, yeah? Most interventions and things that we do not evaluate to see if they work, how they work, and who do they work for. And then even when we do evaluations, yeah, so often they're not used by government, civil society, academics to inform what's done, yeah? So implementing strategies that have been shown to work means that we're more likely to be putting our money, our time, and our valuable resources in things that will actually work. So that's a really, I think, an important point. And the Global Report on Ageism provides the best available evidence around what works. There are also, in terms of those strategies, we looked at, well, what recommendations, what are the most important things to be doing? So, as I said, investing in these three evidence-based strategies: policy and law, education, intergenerational activities. They are our best buys in terms of reducing ageism. But we also need to improve the data and research to gain, for example, a better understanding of ageism in various different contexts and really how to reduce it. So, for example, what are the exact, the most important characteristics in setting up an intergenerational activity? We know some of them, but even more research would help us refine how we actually conduct those activities. And then the last one is really around trying to build a movement to change the narrative around age and aging. And if we can create, a more positive and more accurate narratives, we know that culture is fluid, it can change, yeah? We've seen huge changes around, women over the last number of decades. So, social change is really possible. So what I've done is just given you a quick look at, well, what is ageism? How did it play out within the pandemic? And how is it still playing out in some places in terms of the pandemic? How prevalent is it? Why it's such a problem, because it's got such negative impacts? What are the 3 strategies that work? And then what are the broad recommendations that WHO proposes on going forward? But this is, as Anna mentioned, the 3rd in a series of webinars. And I know some of you may have been involved in the other webinars and have already started to look at setting up interventions or strategies or developing action plans. So I'm going to pass back over to Anna at this point if anybody has any questions on that first part of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Ilana. As Ilana said, we know that this is the 3rd, and while there's a little bit of a format change today, we did want to encourage people to come back. There was a kind of reporting back built in to see some of the progress that you guys have made on your own action plans from last session. So by all means, if anyone would like to come forward with any comments or questions about some of the progress they've made, this would be the time. And then again, as Ilana said, there's a little bit more presentation to be delivered, and we'll go into a more general Q&A towards the end of the session. But if anyone would like to come forward with their kind of progress or any questions about what they've done so far, Ilana is more than happy to respond. So if please feel free to use the raise your hand function, and I'll let us sit in silence for a little bit to give people the opportunity to come forward. And if not, then I'll hand things back over to you, Ilana. Any brave souls today?
So there was a question, Anna, just to reiterate, which department within the Government of Canada is sponsoring the webinar?
Yeah. Oh, you know what? My apologies. I responded to that privately.
Oh,
I will copy that information into the more general chat for everybody.
Yeah. Hi, Francis. I can see that there's a question there from Francis around, are older people less aware of ageism than younger people and therefore do not report it? It's a difficult one to answer, in the sense that certainly younger people report in Europe, because Francis, that's the only region in which we have comparative data. They report discrimination more frequently on the basis of age. Whether older people have become, in some ways, inculcated, ageism, and therefore their expectations are that they may be not included in activities, or they may not be prioritized in terms of healthcare resources or something. It's possible that their own internalization of ageism impacts on their ability to report. So, but it's a difficult one to know, yeah, because obviously, I guess the only way you would be able to test that would be to ask people, and then to inform them around ageism, and then to ask them again in a sense of getting us, to understand whether, by having improved understanding of the nature of ageism and how it plays out, whether then people report it more frequently. But it is possible.
Thanks, Hannah. I also see a comment from Ronnie. I'm not quite sure what he means here. Ronnie, would you like to come forward with your comment?
Alana had demonstrated one of the results of the report, that 1 out of 2 persons are holding ageist attitudes. And I was wondering, what is the proportion of older adults within the group of those 50% who hold negative attitudes towards age?
A good question, Ronnie, and I don't have the data on board, but you find it in the report. So the study was the World Values Survey, and it covered 59 countries of 18-year-olds and above. Yeah. Certainly the proportion of people 60 and older was, I mean, it was a representative sample of those different countries. So in that regard, you would expect to see anything between 10 and, 15% perhaps of the population that were older adults.
Thanks, Alana. I see a question here from Denise as well, and it's kind of about resources and effective intervention. So I wonder whether that's a good segue into the second half of your presentation, Alana, because I know you're going to talk about a few kind of practical examples here.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And then maybe let's see if I do answer that question. If not, I'm happy to.
Sounds good. And if not, then we will certainly return to it during the Q&A.
Great. So I think I just wanted to stress that, I mean, I think it's an exciting opportunity in terms of what we can collectively do to prevent and respond to ageism. And in the sense that there's something that all of us can do. So I wanted to, for those who aren't already working on strategies, maybe just give some ideas about things that you could think about doing. Now, these slides are quite text rich, so there's a lot of text on there. I did that so that you would have some resource after the webinar if you wanted to refer back to and have some sort of ideas around what you could do. So in terms, remember, there was 3 strategies that worked: policy and law, education, and intergenerational activities. And you're very welcome to put in the chat, do you work for government, just to get a sense? Are you civil society? Who's on the call? Are you academic or are you working in the private sector? Yeah. But if you're in the government, yeah, then there's an opportunity to either implement policies and laws that can prohibit age discrimination, or repeal the existing laws that are in fact discriminatory on the basis of age. And even if you're in a country and you've got policies, many countries don't have great enforcement mechanisms. So that's an area that governments can strengthen. And if governments don't have their own national laws and strategies, they can still adopt, for example, a regional treaty or a regional, if that exists. For example, there's one in the Americas around the rights of older persons. Governments also can design and deliver educational interventions across all levels of education. You could intervene in preschools, in primary school, in high school, in all different levels, lifelong learning around education. In terms of if you work in a company, there are real opportunities to try and build the capacity of both the employees and the employers to detect and respond to ageism, how to identify ageism within the workplace, and how to effectively respond to it. And be careful if you've got new products, and you're a company and you're trying to market them, to make sure that you're not being ageist in the way that you're marketing the various different services or products that you're developing. Civil society has an incredibly important role in advocating for policies and laws. I think many of you probably on the call have been very proactive in advocating for an international convention on the rights of older persons. That's a great example of civil society activism, around an intervention which we know that works, yeah? Building capacity to even know how to advocate, how to influence, are really important. And also how to design and deliver those interventions that work. Same thing with academics. They can help us in terms of identifying the essential characteristics. Remember what I told you about the evidence base and the fact that a lot of evidence isn't used, but we still have many gaps. academics can help us fill those research gaps. In terms of data, there are huge opportunities, again, for governments, including ageism as modules in existing surveys or running specific surveys to understand more about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination on the basis of age. We're, for example, WHO, we're in the process of developing a new measurement scale. How can you measure all those different aspects of ageism? It's an area, if academics are interested, we would love to work with you to test and use that scale. Civil society can contribute to improving our access to data and research by monitoring and evaluating the strategies that we know work, but also there are promising strategies like campaigning. The evidence isn't very strong, but if we do more research in understanding what works in campaigning, maybe that will be able to be another intervention that works in the future. Understanding how ageism plays out in people's lives is a really important area for further research. And trying to understand better both how ageism plays out in the workplace and how to address it are good opportunities for the private sector. The last sort of overarching recommendation that we had was also that in terms of building this movement, changing the narrative around age and aging. And there, WHO, with other UN agencies and civil societies, working towards sort of a global coalition to address ageism. And so there we want to encourage both national and local actors to come together across stakeholders and sectors to really advocate, raise awareness about ageism and what you can do to address it. We want to have more exchange between local, national, regional activities on ageism. Certainly the private sector, if they start and continue to implement these evidence-based interventions, that will help, you know, change the narrative. And then civil society, I think there's a real opportunity for trying to help people understand what is ageism and why it is so damaging, and also the fact that it can be combated, needs to be combated, and there are interventions that work. Also encouraging governments to develop, you know, national coalitions or groups of people that work together to improve awareness and advocacy and action to tackle ageism. So there are lots of opportunities, either in implementing the 3 evidence-based strategies, improving our data and research, or helping really change the narrative around age and aging. So that comes to sort of a close of where I think that there are some immediate opportunities, you know, that you could think about in terms of contributing to preventing and responding to ageism. But I also wanted to take the opportunity today just to highlight, you know, one research gap we found, and to give you an example of something new that's recently come out. Many of you would have heard about artificial intelligence. You know, the world today is becoming increasingly impacted by the application of what we call AI, or artificial intelligence. And the sort of implicit and explicit, or the biases around age that we have within our society, are often found in these new technologies, yeah? So, and it's being used everywhere. And so often we're not really aware of how artificial intelligence is being used, yeah? But it is being used in public health, in the development of medicines for older people, in trying to look at data and predict which older people might have more health risks than others, helping develop, you know, and test drugs, identifying how to maybe prioritize care management in terms of older age, you know, in so many different areas. artificial intelligence is being used within healthcare. So, but there are risks, and there are very serious concerns about how age-related bias might be playing out in the way that artificial intelligence is being developed and used as relates to older people. And there's a sense that that can't go unchecked. So artificial technologies can perpetuate ageism in society, and therefore undermine the sort of health and social care that older people receive, yeah? Because the data that's used in terms of artificial intelligence, yeah, can often not be very representative of older people. It can be very stereotypical, you know, in the sense of just considering all older people as if they're the same, yeah, when we know that older people are so heterogeneous, yeah, but the data often treats older people in very stereotypical ways. And the problem with that is that also, you know, if there is data which is very stereotypical or based on flawed assumptions, i.e., again, all older people the same, all older people experience, you know, declines in their physical or their mental health at a certain age, which we know not to be the case. All older people, you know, that older people cost so much money and will, you know, put a burden on our healthcare system. So if people are thinking in terms of these stereotypes around age and aging, then they're going to inform, you know, the way that artificial intelligence produces results, yeah. And as a result, they can impact negatively, for example, on harming the way that maybe generations, you know, connect, or even deepen existing barriers in terms of digital access. So, for example, if the stereotype, you know, that all older people find it difficult to use new technology, yeah, if that thinking, which is not true, yeah, but if that assumption and misconception is used, then the way that the data and artificial will maybe not lend itself to supporting older people to get access to training or to develop technologies that are suited in terms of older people, or even engage older people in the development of those technologies. But what we found was that there were 8 ways that we could make sure that artificial intelligence, yeah, benefits older people, yeah, and reduces the impact of ageism. So one of them is making sure that the way that artificial intelligence is designed is done with and considering older people, but not with age-based stereotypes. A lot of AI is developed by very large data science teams. So making sure that those teams involve younger and older people, yeah, so that they're really age diverse. Making sure that when they're collecting data that's going to inform and be used in terms of artificial intelligence, that is age inclusive. We're considering all age groups within that data. Trying to improve in digital literacy in terms of older people will help in terms of their understanding of AI, but also their engagement in the processes related to it. Making sure that the rights of older people to consent and even contest what's happening are upheld. And making sure that we've got governance frameworks around artificial intelligence that require that in the use of artificial intelligence, older people are engaged in that processes and empowered to understand and work with AI. We need a lot more research, so we've collected some, but to really understand, as there are new uses of artificial intelligence, how we can avoid age-related bias. And we need some really strong ethical processes in place to make sure that the development and application of AI is ethical and doesn't disadvantage people on the basis of age or for other reasons. But if you want to know more, if you're interested in artificial intelligence and how it plays out and its connection with ageism, particularly we looked at this within the health sector, and you want to learn more about legal, non-legal and technical measures that can be used to minimize the risk of exacerbating or even introducing ageism in these technologies, then we have a policy brief that you might be interested in, which is available at this link. And so I've just shown on this slide, a lot of the work I talked about was based on the Global Report on Ageism. More recently, Ageism in Artificial Intelligence for Health. And then there is a toolkit which provides some very concrete guidance about what you can do as individuals in terms of tackling ageism, but also within your own social or family networks. Anna, I'm going to stop here.
Fantastic. Okay. Feel free to take on the slides, Lana. We can kind of move into a discussion with everybody. I think I'm gonna, we'll circle back to some of the previous questions, but I wanted to just touch briefly while we have the AI conversation going. I know, as you said, AI is often based on big data sets and kind of developing algorithms based on those data sets.
Yeah.
And we know that there's massive gaps in terms of the data that's currently available on older adults, and certainly like the nuance within that data. Do you know of any of the strategies that they're currently kind of working on to kind of mitigate the gaps in data? I know that it's a big problem right now as well for AI in terms of racialized communities and things like this, that we don't have appropriate data sets, and therefore algorithms tend to kind of perpetuate existing societal norms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in terms of one of the recommendations. We need more data. We need more data which is not stereotypical, which is not based on misconceptions around age and aging.
Yep.
And I think that comes back also to one of the recommendations around tackling ageism, in the sense that we just need improved data and research, in that sense. But I think, trying to look at the various different ways that AI is being used in terms of and understanding more about machine learning and what are those how are they modeling that data, how are they analyzing that data, how is age being used in the way that they are asking the questions, is an area, and I think that's why we wanted to highlight it. We really feel like it's such a growing area, and it's being used in so many different ways that we're not even aware of.
Absolutely.
And that there's really time, I think, now in terms of trying to highlight the potential implications of stereotypes and bias around the use of AI as relates to all age groups, but particularly, perhaps particularly older people.
Awesome. Thanks, Alana. All right, I'm going to circle back. I know, Denise, you had a question kind of before we moved into the second half of the presentation on suggested list of resources on interventions and effectiveness. So Alana, I know that you kind of provided a couple examples, but I wonder whether you can kind of touch on a few salient examples. One of the suggestions here is, are there any intergenerational activities that you know of or that have been implemented that have helped to tackle ageism, and potentially whether there's any resources through WHO that we could be pointing these lovely people in the direction of?
Yeah. So in fact, the Global Report on Ageism has a whole chapter on intergenerational contact interventions, and it looks at why they work, what are the characteristics that you need to consider in terms of intergenerational contact, and then it provides some examples. So, I think that's worth looking at. And I mean, there are some things, that you need to consider in terms of those interventions. For example, the idea that there is reciprocity in intergenerational contact is an important issue. So it's the idea that it's not just one way. It's not just older people providing to younger people, but often the idea that both are learning from that contact and from that experience. certainly the quality of the contact and the frequency of the contact also make a difference. You know, if you look at one, you know, a frequent example that's been used more and more is around intergenerational housing. So where you're looking at, for example, I'm based in Switzerland, yeah? So here, a lot of older people have houses that are not because their families may have left, they may have lost their partner, have got a lot more space than they need, yeah? So the local government looks at linking students who are going to university. Accommodation is incredibly expensive in Geneva. So linking students with older people in terms of getting them access to housing, but then the younger person may provide, you know, is there to have meals with the older person, may support in shopping or gardening or having some certain activities. So there are a number of examples of intergenerational housing, which is in effect an intergenerational contact strategy, yeah, whereby there is reciprocal benefits from that intergenerational contact. So that's an example of one. Similar thing in terms of intergenerational contact between nursing homes and creches, yeah, where you've got older people and pre-primary school children being looked after within the same setting, yeah. So these are examples of bringing together different generations, which have been shown, if the right characteristics are in place, to reduce stereotypes and prejudice around different age groups.
Thanks very much, Alana. Kind of dovetailing off of that, I see a question here from Indu about kind of the impact of cultural norms on ageism. Indu, would you like to come forward with your question?
Yes.
If not,
I was raised in a society where intergenerational homes were norms. And we all learned about the wisdom of older people. And when I work in Canada with the First Nations and Inuit, they have the similar values there. And years ago, if I called anyone in a community to get and take the patient from the emergency department, they will come. Over the years, it has gone down in communities. And I'm just wondering whether we have lost a valuable thing over the years by urbanization and not having as many intergenerational homes.
thanks, Indu. Alana, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, Indu, it's a really important point, and I think you touch on, you know, some of the drivers there in terms of why we've possibly experienced more ageism or why it's increasing over time, and that's, you know, so you know, demographies change. We are less likely to live in the same, you know, house and or town or area in terms of our family members. We tend to be much more mobile, so that decreases sort of, you know, social contact, you know, between generations within families and more broadly. I mean, so I think, you know, looking at and I think that's why we're now looking at how do you foster intergenerational contact, because some of those demographic and you know, sort of broad trends around urbanization, but the fact that more of us are working longer hours or working, you know, have longer working lives, that also impacts in terms potentially in terms of the time for more social intergenerational contact, although obviously having multi-generational workforces is an incredible opportunity for enhancing intergenerational contact if employers and employees are educated around ageism and can shine a light on it if they experience it within their workplace.
Thanks very much, Alana. A question here from Hillary. about some kind of around kind of language use, I think, Hillary, right? So if you'd like to come forward, by all means. I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, I was just commenting that in Canada, the term senior is very widely used, and some people who are in that age range strongly object to being called seniors because it has, I think, attracted some derogatory baggage over the years, while others really like being that term being applied to them. I notice a bit of a trend, which I like, towards replacing the term by older adults, but it is very commonly used here. The UN report on communications did advise against that term along with others, and I just wondered a little bit about that. Thank you.
Hillary, it's a great point. I mean, language evolves, and you would have seen in the communication guide in English, because in fact, in many other languages, we don't really have the evidence. But for example, the term elderly was found to really incite very negative stereotypes around older people. So we discourage the use of the word elderly in that sense. But in many cultures, the use of the word elder, or seniors has a sense of reverence, and it's something that they welcome. So I think, and you framed it very nicely in the sense that it is important to use terms that people feel comfortable, with. So at the end of the day, it's up to people how they wish to be called, in that sense. I think one important guidance is remembering, that it's people first. So we tend to promote what's called people first language, whether that be, older people, so putting the emphasis on the person, and trying to not, and then being more specific, or people, people who are 60 and older, or people who are 80, or people who, who live in, older people who live in rural areas. So being very specific about it rather than trying to categorize everybody as if somehow they're the same.
Thanks very much, Alana. I see a comment here from Meryl a little bit about, I think, the tension between kind of how do we advocate meaningfully and actually drive action rather than kind of purely conversation around topics like ageism, which I think is something we probably all struggle with a little bit. Meryl, would you like to kind of come forward and with your question or comment?
Well, what I want to say is we are a little local grassroots community in Brandon, Manitoba, and there was about 14 nonprofits. We got together and we usually put on a health and wellness fair, and we have the RHA involved, which is our local regional health authority, and they help. And this year, well, last year we did a survey, and we actually asked people in an open-ended question, what topics would you like us to look at, work on to help you moving forward? Because we were doing it virtually. And what really came out was the gaps and the barriers came back to us. So we actually sent it to a university to actually get analyzed so that we were using evidence-based responses. And our local city is doing a 30-year plan. And when we went to speak to them and present them with these responses, their priorities were and should always be about like the homeless, the children, mental health and addiction, but they didn't really include older adults in that design look. And when we asked them like to make sure policy and that some of the organizations are feeling that they were giving lip service, like saying, we'll look into working with you. We want this collaborative, but they aren't reaching back out. And how do we ensure that this sort of, I guess, feeling of left off the table doesn't continue? Like, how do you work and generate the momentum when it seems that the community is behind you, but the like local government, that's not in their list of priorities.
It's a great question. And it reminds me, just as an aside, and then I'm going to come back to it, is that on the 29th, we're going to show some films that have been made by older people about what is important to them and what they think that local governments should be doing in response. Yeah. So maybe we can share that through IFA as well. And one of those was actually, so these have been films that have been supported by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and one of them was done in Manitoulin Island. And I say this because one of the important things there is, as you've done, is understanding what's important for the community and what needs to happen to be able to address some of the challenges. So that's the first step. The second step is, how do you get that on the political agenda? Yeah. So how can you use the collective force of the community, if they're behind you, either to have some opportunity where you invite local government representatives to listen to community members, to listen to the evidence and to understand what are the concerns. But I think it's also very important in having that discussion to be able to provide ideas around how you think those gaps can be addressed. It's also perhaps useful, depending on your context, to draw on other evidence. For example, if you're talking around why, age-based discrimination is problematic, being able to draw on things like the Global Report on Ageism, which says that it's very prevalent, incredibly detrimental and costly to individuals and societies. That also provides additional support for the arguments that you've identified in terms of community level. There are other strategies. Obviously, leadership is important. So how do you identify somebody who is influential within your community, who you can talk to and who can advocate? So, in terms of, trying to influence those people that either hold the purse strings or take the decisions, or otherwise building networks and affiliations, with other groups that do have the ear of decision makers. So there are a number of different strategies that can be used to try and get issues on the table. So I think it sounds like you've made a great start, yeah? And maybe now thinking around what else can you do with that information? Do you need additional resources to complement it? Who do you need to get that information to? And who else needs to be sharing that information on your behalf to have the ear of decision makers? So I think there's a number of strategies you could consider within your community to try and get more action on the basis of the issues that older people are raising themselves.
Thanks very much, Alana. A comment here from Nur Kazi about the importance of kind of ethnicities and cultures within the context of intergenerational relations. Nur, would you like to come forward with your comments?
Yes, I am many times joining with this cafe and a discussion that I was a researcher on IPA a few years back. So my domain is ethnicity and the cultural values. All the discussion I heard last 2 years, it shows that all the global issues, United Nations and big nations and big peoples, everything big. And COVID also big pandemic. So, but victim of the COVID is the elderly people. Most of the elderly people died in this COVID years. And Most of them are from ethnic communities and the cultural communities and people's living within families. So these things I have seen that no discussion. But intergenerational issues, the aging, it's a very good topics and they were discussed. Elena has done very well and elaborately. She has discussed the things, and that is the main problems. One day by day, the as the capitalistic way of lifestyle and the individualistic way of lifestyle day by day very much high in peak. So the younger generation and the new technology, that is the AI, the very much important issues that the AI, when now it is dominating everything. But the elderly people are day by day, they are going back to back, and they have lost all their traditional knowledge, ethnic knowledge. But even now, most of the people, they're living within their own ethnic communities and as well as their ethnic families. Canada is a multicultural state. I am living here last 30 years in Montreal, in Toronto. I have seen the most vulnerable elderly peoples are the ethnic people.
Thanks very much, Nur.
Immigrant population also inclusive, as because all countries are mostly have some immigration issue, but this new immigrant population and their elderly people more suffer. Nobody take care of them. No family care even. No state care looking after them. Everything is data, the policy, and from United Nations to everywhere. There are many data, but in the implementing sector, it's not strong enough to go to the elderly people, to serve the elderly people, and we are now worse sufferer, being an elderly segment. And the ageism, it's everything new normal is coming up in this world, so we have to
I'm gonna jump in a little bit as we approach the hour. I just want to give Alana the opportunity to respond before we close out our session for the day. I think you've brought up a lot of really good points and really important points, and I just want to make sure that Alana has time to appropriately respond before we all break off. So Alana, I'm going to turn things over to you. A really important issue, I think, to end today's session on. So I'll kind of hand the floor over to you.
It's great, thanks, Noor, because I think it is an important issue, and I mentioned it, but maybe didn't stress it. But there is real intersectionality in terms of ageism and race, and ageism and sex, and ageism and disability, and these all intersect and multiply disadvantage that people may be experiencing. So, you know, if you're an older ethnic woman, with some disability, you're more likely to experience sort of multiple disadvantage. So that's one issue which you're highlighting, which is really important. Another important issue which links is the issue I said around data. If we don't have data, and if data is not disaggregated on socioeconomic conditions, on other demographic factors, then we're not really going to know who's being left behind and how they're being left behind, or even what's in, you know, how those impacts differ across different people. So, you know, we need improved data to be able to disaggregate and understand perhaps different groups within the larger group. So if we just keep it as a big group, obviously, you know, we're so diverse, we don't get the nuances in terms of the differences between different groups. So that's a really, I think, an important area. I think the other thing, and I wanted to, and I just put a link in there in terms of you can register if you want to come and listen to the films. I think they're a really interesting example of, I'm thinking of the one in Canada in particular, of older people sharing their experience and their knowledge with younger generations and their desire to be able to do that. So I think that, you know, we need to constantly, as the evidence suggests, encourage intergenerational contact, and intergenerational contact can be around maybe exchange of, you know, of experience, different cultural aspects which are not being shared in terms of generations. So there are lots of opportunities to bring culture and cultural exchange within intergenerational contact. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alana. I see also, just before we break off, there's been lots of conversation about kind of coming together around some shared resources and what people are doing. Perhaps we can kind of respond to some of that in some of the post-session materials. I know that there's mechanisms certainly through WHO and the digital platform for the decade now that really encourages kind of that knowledge sharing and transmission of good practice. So we can provide some of those and some of the resources that have been shared in the chat as well. So with that being said, I know we've approached the hour quite rapidly, as we always do. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the Government of Canada for your support for this webinar, and a big thank you to Alana for stepping into the last minute to support us today. So thank you all, and we hope you have a lovely day. Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful day. Great to see you all, and thank you very much for joining. Thanks, Lord. Lovely to see some familiar names and faces.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Good
Lovely to see you
Cynthia.
too.
See you again.